We are back, I think. There we go. We are back. Our fifth session of the day is a little bit of a panel format because I had three great writers wanting to talk on a topic, even though one of them thinks she's a moderator. No, she's got opinions on the topic as well. Tina Gower, our moderator, is a Writers of the Future winner from volume 29. One of our world building experts is Marina Lostetter. I believe she was also 29, but she'll correct me. And Andrea Stewart, I am not sure. I thought she was 28 or 30. I thought she was either before or after.
Also 29.
So these are a trio who really got together early on in their careers and learned to work together, which is one of the benefits, again, of a writing community, which Writers of the Future, one of the things it is a community that they are out and wanted to talk on this topic together. Take it away, ladies.
All right.
Oh, hey, there's Andrea.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I'm
okay. You're like, wee, sliding
all
in
my
there.
stuff together.
All right, so we're super excited to be talking about world building with everybody today. And before we get started, I was hoping that Andrea and Marina could give a little bit of a longer introduction and some of the books and things that they've written and stories that they have out there. So why don't you go first, Andrea?
Oh, me. Okay. Okay, so I'm the author of the Drowning Empire trilogy. I had to go grab my books because I always forget to do this. There's the first one, which is like the Bone Shard Daughter. And then there's the second one that came out in November, the Bone Shard Emperor. And then I just handed the third one to my editor. So we'll see how that goes. And then I have short stories in a variety of venues. Galaxy's Edge is one I think we've all three of us have been in. Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Daily Science Fiction, IGMS, and then various anthologies. So, yeah. And it was volume 29, and we were all in volume 29 together.
Yes. Is it my turn?
Yes, Marina, go ahead.
I'm Marina Lostetter. My first trilogy was the Numenon trilogy. Last year, I had two books come out. The first one was The Hum of Midnight in a new trilogy called The Five Penalties. The second book comes out next February, but at the end of this month, we get the paperback version, so that's exciting. This one's fantasy. And then the other book I had come out last year was sci-fi. It's called Activation Degradation, and it is a standalone. So it's a one-off. So I do sci-fi, fantasy, also have short stories in various places, and I won't name them all. Just we'll get along with it. Let's go.
And I'm Tina Gower, and I write science fiction and fantasy under this name. I have a self-published series that's kind of more of an urban fantasy that actually did really well. I co-wrote a book with Mike Resnick called INCI, which is a science fiction. And then I have various short stories all over the place and won some awards. And then I also write romance. And I write that under Alice Ferris. And then I have an agent, and I'm constantly on sub. In fact, I have two books on sub right now. All right, so let's get started talking about world building. And first of all, where do you get started? Talk a little bit about your process, like how do you even get this thing going? You're creating an entire world. Where do you go? And let's see. Yeah, Andrea, jump in.
Sure. Okay. So usually with world building, I'll start with kind of a core concept, something that interests me that I've wanted to explore. And I kind of mash that together with other things that I've been wanting to write about. Marina already knows, like, the inspiration for the Bone Shard Daughter came from Marina, actually. When we were all
had an incident.
Yeah, Marina had an incident. We were all out to lunch, and she got Chinese food from a food court in San Antonio, which is not the best place to get Chinese food from. And ended up almost choking on a shard of bone that was in her food. I was like, like, what if like bone shards equals magic? So I started thinking about that and then kind of mashing that together with other ideas that I had wanted to explore. Like I knew I had wanted to write like fantasy constructs. I knew I had wanted to write like about a palace of locked doors. So I kind of just like combined all these ideas together and then kind of started thinking, well, what would logically follow in this world from these things? And that's like kind of how I approach world building in the very beginning.
I'm kind of similar. Yeah, and then I'm very piecemeal in the way that I world build. So usually I'm very plot first rather than concept first. So I'll start being like, ooh, here's the end result. Like I know what the ending is, and then I kind of like backtrack from there plot wise. So I'll just start writing and kind of throwing in weird things that come to mind as I go. So my initial world building process is very much like, oh, what if I put in this and this and this, and wouldn't that be cool? And I'll just throw all this in and then slowly have to like work that all into a structure that makes sense. So it's very just like hodgepodge, throw it all in the soup sort of a situation in the beginning.
That's pretty cool to see that you guys come about it in kind of different ways. Marina, you give me hope because I am very much like I'm walking along in my world and then poof, oh, you know, it would be great here. Yeah. And then how do you guys keep track of all the different ideas as they come to make sure that you're not accidentally saying something in one place and then contradicting yourself in another? How do you keep track of all this information? Actually, Andrea, go first because I know where you do it. That you actually have a system.
I have a system, but as I've told people before, I'm like aspirationally organized. So I try to put things into a wiki, which I have. So I use SlimWiki, and I kind of just drop relevant info in there that I need to be keeping track of and being consistent about. Like, oh, hey, there's this ancient language, and this is how you say these words in this language. And then I can refer back to it whenever I have to go back and write something else out in that language, some kind of phrase. However, I don't always update it when I'm supposed to. So it's been really helpful for me, but I don't think that I'm as organized as it sounds. So that's like how I keep track of those things. It's also great having a copy editor to help point out things like, hey, you said this over here. And then later on, like this has changed. So they're really good at keeping track of those kind of consistency issues. That's how I mostly keep track of those things. I didn't actually start it until after I finished my first book, because I think when you have just one book in a series, it's a lot easier to keep track of what's going on in there and your world building. But when you start to get into a second and then a third book, you start to forget what you had written earlier and remembering like, like where are the islands and, where things are located, like north, west, east, south, that kind of thing. It's very helpful, I think, to have a map.
Yes, Andrea would like to bemoan her organizational skills, but mine are non-existent. So I very much so rely on my copy editor on the back end, which is a bit unfair, I'm sure. I do a lot of like searching the Word document and hoping I remember how I spelled a thing, right? Just hoping I can get it down. I also rely a lot on my husband, who has a much better memory than I do. And he's my first reader. So he will often be like, hey, wait, didn't you say X, Y, and Z over here? And then in my most recent, in my fantasy novel, The Helm of Midnight, I kind of went easy on myself because everything takes place in one valley. So it's like the map is small. Can't get too lost, right? So at least, I guess I did have a map. That's a little bit of an organizational skill. And that was really only because Alex was like, you need a map. So, it can be done even when you're bad at it. You can world build and not keep track of anything. It'll work out in the end. It's fine, I swear.
It is nice when there's a map. And actually that perfectly segues into what I thought that we should talk about next. And that's, when you're building a world, you have to take some geographical things into consideration. And I think that both of you have built yourselves unique worlds in the books that you have written. For example, Andrea has islands that migrate. And then I'm always fascinated with Nominon and the fact that you could build a world that goes millennia. So you're not just thinking about what is on this generational ship, but in the future, how is this going to look? Like, how are these people going to evolve? So I find both of those very fascinating. And I was just hoping that we could kind of talk a little bit about geography and about more into the actual visual aspects of building a world where, how do you go about doing that, and advice to new writers. And let's see, how about we have Marina go first? I've been putting
okay.
Andrea going first so many times. Yeah, let's do that.
So Numenon was interesting because I did give myself borders. Like you said, it's all in a convoy of generation ships is where the majority of the story takes place. So I am still kind of confined while they are moving throughout the galaxy and then the universe, because the whole trilogy takes place over more than 100,000 years. But also each chapter in itself is kind of its own short story because we are taking these huge leaps and bounds. So I was kind of able to confine the steps of world building into, instead of like in a regular formatted novel, you have this streamline that where all of the world building has to be really interconnected. This is more like stepping stones for me, which is like, okay, this world is like this now, and then, oh, they've developed this technology, so this is a little bit different here, and I can just kind of like build in blocks, and I didn't have to quite wrap it all together the same way I've had to do in the fantasy novel. So I think compartmentalizing has been really helpful for me to be like, oh, okay, here is these parameters and here are these parameters, and being sure that like within any given chapter or piece of the story, I'm not trying to like wrangle everything together. I'm like really focused in on what's important in the moment. So that kind of helps me with the whole scatterbrained world building process that I have. So hopefully that'll help somebody else who's also scatterbrained build their world in a consistent manner.
So you're talking about taking geography into effect. So when I was building the world for Bone Shard Daughter, so there are islands and they do migrate, and they actually follow the seasons for a certain number of years. So I thought a lot about how that affects the lives of the people in this world. And I think that's one of the important things. Like, I really, really love how with fantasy, you can basically do almost anything. You get really creative with your world building. And I've seen some really, really neat stuff done. But at the same time, if you're doing that kind of stuff, I think you really, really need to make sure that you're not only just being consistent, but these things carry through into these people's lives. Because if you forget to do that, then your reader's going to forget, like, oh, there is this cool thing going on in this world. So it would be very easy for me to just kind of say, hey, the islands migrate once, and then for people just to forget about that if I don't have those effects shown in the world and in the lives of the people that live in it. So one of the things that I made sure to do is, okay, well, if the islands are migrating and they're following the seasons, then, I've noted that, hey, and this is in a tropical setting. So there's like, they experience 7 years of a dry season and then 7 years of a wet season, and that goes in that kind of cycle. Another thing is that if the islands are moving around, then it's not as simple to navigate them as it would be in our world. So in this world, they have specific to this profession is they have like a navigator, and they have to attend this school and they have to learn how to do these complicated calculations and reference these charts to figure out like, oh, well, which direction are we going in? So things like that. Like, I think it is like that where you have to, like if you have something going on in your environment, you have to touch on it. I think again and again throughout your story to remind your reader that that is happening. Because I have seen books where I'm like, wow, that's a really cool concept. That's a really interesting world that they built. And then I forget that these things are part of the world because it's not affecting the lives of the people. They're not thinking about it. They're not taking it into account as they're living their daily lives. So that's kind of what I was thinking. That's kind of what I was looking at when I was thinking about the geography of my world. I know some people get really in depth with this kind of thing. I play it a little loosey goosey, like, because I know some people are like, well, you can't have like a mountain range here because of like these kind of geological things. And I'm like, I just don't do that. So some people may decide that that's something that's really important to them. I'm kind of like a person that goes a lot for the vibe. So
I absolutely love it. And I love how much weather does play a part into your story. And I think that I remember when I was a kind of like very early on writing, and somebody had given the advice of that you want your world or your setting to be like another character. And so if you really look at it as another character, exactly what you're saying, it has to have your setting, your world has to have its own goal, and it has to have conflict. So if it's not conflict, which means it's going to also cause conflict for the characters, then, it's not going to be interesting. And, we're completely focused on the characters at that point. So let's see. Speaking of characters, for those of you who don't know, I think Andrea is probably going to share it, but she does have this like really amazing outline that talks about things to consider character background when building your world at the same time. And I basically just I use it. I've been using it while trying to kind of go through and outline my own book. And so one of the pieces in that outline is culture. And so the considerations that we need to take into account, because when you're building your world, it's filled with people. So we need to figure out what people and what are their, what are their backgrounds. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Marina, do you have any particular way, anything, advice for writers on how to go about that and making sure that your world is as rich as it possibly can be with culture?
Well, it's kind of the same thing that Andrea was saying with geography, is that you got to remember that everything you put in there is going to affect people's lives. So with, let's say in my fantasy worlds, I like to focus on religion a lot and how, a very different religion, obviously, from any world religions that we have here. And so I tried to think about like daily, how much any given character thinks about religion or gods and how that might affect their daily life. Whether or not they are very religious or not might affect their daily life. Whether or not you have multiple religious systems is going to, as you were saying before, create conflict even within the world building. So it's another one of those just kind of innate aspects of any, culture in general is going to play out differently, be displayed differently through different characters in different ways. So thinking about how those dynamics come together and how those feed into story and character, basically using culture as a layered aspect of a character and of the world building. Like everything that I write, I try to make sure that it's doing double duty. Like any given scene, right, is like it's moving the plot forward and it's showing you character development. So it's also like all of the world building aspects also are playing double duty in my mind, right? Here's the character and this is what this world aspect means to them and also what it means to the greater world at large and how it plays into the plot. So I'm always trying to layer those things together. So I think that would be some of my key advice, is think about the multiple aspects of culture and how they play into everything that's going on all the time.
Absolutely. I loved something that you said there, which was thinking of religion as not necessarily anything that we're picking from our world. And then, and I think that that's something that's really important, especially today, that writers be aware of as a caveat when they're building their world, that they be careful where they draw their inspiration from. So I think that that's like just like a really important point right there. Let's see. I also, looking over here at the comments, I have Dawn Ray. They are saying, do any of you use Pinterest collection for knowing how your characters or world will look like?
I did for
No.
Helm of Midnight. No, Andrew's just like, no. Helm of Midnight I did because I'm not a very visual person when I imagine things. I tend to be more like movement oriented. So I use a lot of verbs. And this might sound strange, but if you look at your own writing, you'll realize you kind of have some aspects that you go to. Lots of people are very visual. Other people are very dialogue oriented. For me, any of the action is kind of what's happening in my brain. I don't necessarily even see people's faces all that clearly. So for Helm of Midnight, because I wanted to create a very specific aesthetic within it, I did use Pinterest a lot just to like help my own brain create new images. Getting that feedback.
Yeah, I don't. I remember after my first book came out, and then one of the questions that I got a lot was, "Oh, like what would you like? What's your fantasy casting for?" And I had to like go and look up actors because I'm like, first off, I'm not very familiar with a lot of actors, and second off, I never really even thought about it. Mostly, I mean, I've sketched them because I actually paint as well, but I never really thought of them as being actual actors. So I don't do that. And then for the landscape, I kind of have it in my head a lot. So yeah. I do want to circle back to
Oh yes, I forgot
the culture.
to.
Yeah.
Yes, culture.
Yeah, about culture.
Absolutely.
Oh, and I'll put in the chat the document that I had put together, because one of the things that Marina was talking about is something that I think about a lot too, which is layering things and trying to touch on like more than one thing at once. So one of the things that I know we always talk about is like, oh, there's, you know, you got to address plot, setting, and then character. And for me, I mean, as obviously Marina thinks so too, it's really important to try to be efficient in your writing. So trying to address all of those things simultaneously, and sometimes even on a sentence level, I think can not only make your writing a lot smoother, but also like easier for people to digest, because you are not like going in this just like block of world building, because when you're looking at the world building, you're also learning stuff about the character and you're learning stuff about plot. So I did do a little workshop recently that was kind of talking about how to address character and setting at the same time. I'll put the little link there. So I did a little thing about questions to ask about your characters and in regards to world building, and how to, so that kind of like gets you thinking about how do you reveal stuff about your character at the same time that you're revealing things about your world. And culture is a good one, because you think about, well, there's like macro culture and then there's micro culture. So the stuff that your character is, the way that they're reacting to things is going to be a result of like the culture in their country, in their city, and their family, because we all have like different family cultures as well. And that can reveal things about your character at the same time as it's revealing things about your world. Because everybody is kind of like an amalgamation of like our memories, our backgrounds, the way that we're raised. And this can really illuminate things. I think that it's not just like, there's specific questions that, like, that I've talked about in that document, like things like, well, what is taboo to this person may not be taboo to another person, and that can also like reveal things about your character, as well as like what's going on in the world itself, like in a kind of macro version.
Yeah, I love your comments about family and how that's going to affect somebody. You know, did they have a family? Was their family like a found family? Were they an orphan? You cover all of those in your series, which I think is pretty cool because being in a fantasy where you've got all these different points of view, you do sort of get like that overview of lots of the world from so many different angles, from so many different, here's somebody who's had it real great in life and here's somebody that hasn't, and you get to see how what the world's like from those different viewpoints. And I think that that's pretty cool. And I think even with Marina, your latest book, Activation Degradation, where you have a character who basically this is the same world, but I don't want to spoil too much, but this particular character is seeing things from
Brand new perspective.
a completely different perspective than the people then that they end up ending up with. I found that very fascinating because you are kind of, as the reader, you're sort of introduced into this world from their point of view, and you think that everything that they're saying is exactly how the world is, and then you realize that it's different. So it's just a very interesting and fresh way to sort of like build a world and then kind of be like, there's another facet to this world and this person is unaware of. So
yes,
I find
it's very unreliable narrator where the narrator does not realize that they are unreliable.
Yes, they don't realize that they're unreliable. And I really love, I just absolutely love those types of, like stories where it's like you were already interested and now it's like, oh my gosh, like now you're learning along with the character, what's going on. So somebody in the question said, they wanted to circle back to religion, and it says, where do you draw inspiration from? How do you suggest we do that? And what do you suggest we look out for?
So one
and I
thing
think that this is not just religion, but overall, overall, not drawing, too much from real life culture, not too much from, what do you, sorry, Marina, go ahead and tell.
Well, I was say it's really difficult in general to like completely blot everything out, right? Because everything you imagine is also a result of things you've been exposed to in some way. And I think part of that is just being like really conscious of where your inspirations are coming from, like really being aware of what you're drawing from and why, and doing everything very deliberately. But specifically with religion, it reminds me when Andrea mentioned taboos, I like to take taboos and then be like, what if actually this taboo was important, like as not a taboo, as a thing you do? Like it's important you do this. For instance, there are aliens in my Numenon series that like the way they get rid of their dead is they eat them. And that's like, it's extremely wasteful to not eat your dead. Why would you not eat your dead, right? So I took something that like most humans balk at all the time. And instead, I made it kind of an essence of the culture, and a culture that would absolutely balk at the idea of not eating your dead. That seems weird to them. So sometimes just inverting things like that can help you go down a completely new path, just because you're like, okay, if I thought about this logically, why would you do this taboo thing that a lot of people think are taboo? Isn't there a logical reason you would do it, or an emotional reason you would do it? And then sometimes I just run with that thing. So again, you're just being really conscious of your thought process and understanding how you're getting from point A to point B and why you're writing what you're writing and what you're trying to say with what you're picking for your world.
Yeah, religion's kind of a hard one for me. I didn't really have like a established religion in these books, although it is a thing that I have written into other works. I think like drawing like real world inspiration, it's fine. There's a lot of common elements in a lot of religions. I think a lot of them, it is just like these stories that people tell themselves about like the origins of the world, how we're supposed to act. And there's like different categories you can go into. Obviously, there's monotheism, or like religions with multiple gods, or ones that are more based on like ancestral obligations. So yeah, I think you can draw some inspiration. Things to avoid, I think, is unless you're trying to make a really unless you're trying to make a point like Philip Pullman or something, you probably don't want to take a religion and just like rip it off wholesale. And I think also being careful to treat it. I want to say respectfully, but like not necessarily, depending on what you're trying to do in your story. I think more to make sure that it has nuance, and not that you have, because I think like where people get into the line where they start offending people is when you're taking something that you're obviously inspired by and you're kind of painting it in black and white. And I think, or you're inspired by something that's already derivative of that work. Yeah. So you're like taking somebody else's point of the original religion, and then kind of you've already like started off with something that's biased and skewed. So I think that's like kind of important not to do. Like if you are yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. I think it's just don't
It's a tough
be
topic.
Careful. Yeah,
It's a touchy, yes.
People are very sensitive about religion. So I would just recommend not like ripping off something wholesale and trying to pass it off as your own. That's probably not the best idea.
I think that when you said the nuance, I think that is key, that you show that nuance and that you be careful when you're like, these people are good, these people are bad. You do want to show some of those bad people being good and some of those good people being bad. So I think that that's, I had gotten some advice. It was in a romance writing convention, but basically like if you're going to take somebody and you're going to create, you know, and they're like, and you inadvertently, like you basically, you don't want to be, here's my this character, here's my that character. You want to have actually 2 or 3, like, so for example, I'll just use, like for me, I'm dyslexic. I don't want my one dyslexic character to fulfill a certain role and show them as being all good or something, because I'm trying to make like a point, you know, like I would have some variety. I would have multiple, hopefully, dyslexic characters. I'm just using that as an example because it's an easy one. But yeah, this is that is a difficult topic to talk about, but it is something that people can get in trouble with in world building, accidentally falling into that.
And I think people also have a hard time, like, so my first tenet when I'm creating a character is I'm creating a person and I treat them like a person. And I know that sounds really obvious, but sometimes people treat a character like they're more of a tool. But that's where I feel like people get off the rails with, you know, like first and foremost, you imagine, okay, I am this person. Doesn't matter who it is. Be like, all right, I'm going to have certain motivations that are about me and how I feel and how I'm interacting with the world. It's not because I am this caricature of a person that wants to go on. Like if you can't place yourself in the character's shoes and actually like be like, all right, what are they actually thinking and feeling? Then you're kind of going off the rails, right? So you need to be able to look at each character and be like, that's an actual person with actual feelings and thoughts, and, you know, be able to kind of embody the sense of them as a human being, or else I feel like you're going to go off the rails there with that.
Yeah. That's a really good piece of advice. Like you don't want every character to be a, you know, oh, here's my character I'm using as a foil for this and this. It's like, you do kind of want to have them to be multifaceted.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of where people go off the rails on like stereotypes, right? Is they're like, oh, I think this person is like this, but they can't actually like imagine a person like that. They can imagine like a tool, like a cardboard version of a person rather than a person.
It's like the whole D&D thing, right? Like, oh, all orcs are evil and stuff like that, right? You don't want to treat a people as a monolith, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So continuing on, like with our kind of moving within the culture and within the world, one of the pieces that is really always seems to be very difficult for me is economics. And Andrea always has great advice for me on that. And I think it's really cool because, yeah, you do.
Which is news to Andrea.
I know. She's like, what?
Buy low, sell high. I don't know.
as far as like just like your background as an analyst and everything, and taking into account like the money system, like how does it work? I think that also, Andrea, you had a very interesting economic system in your world, and then as well as Marina, who actually used in one of your novels the Helm of Midnight time and as currency, which I thought was very fascinating. So both of you have some very amazing ideas as far as economy and thinking completely outside of the box. Andrea, do you have any insight on economics?
It's funny because I actually studied economics in school, and that's like what I have my degree in. I don't use like any of that when I'm world building, because there's a lot of statistics and graphs, and God, I think that would be pretty boring for a fantasy reader. I think for economics, I think it's just important to think logically, like what is scarce in your world, what is valuable, and sometimes that's not necessarily related to scarcity. It's related more to like who's got control of stuff. And that's another thing, is like who has control over the resources that everybody needs. So I know Tina was talking about how we have like interesting resources in our world. In my world, there's something called whetstone, which they mine, and they burn it to summon wind to make their ships go faster. So this is very important for their economy, because it's set on an archipelago of islands. So in order to facilitate trade, they have to use this whetstone in order to get things to places in the time that people expect it, right? It's like Amazon, right? We can't go back. Everybody expects 2-day shipping now. So whoever controls that has a lot of control over the economy. And since it is an empire, and since there's an emperor, the emperor is the one that controls the trade for that. So there is legalized trade of whetstone, which has to be approved by the emperor. But because it is so valuable, there is like a illegal trade of it as well. So that's something I think is important to consider as well in your culture, is like, is there something that is valuable to people that they are trading illegally or like under the table? And how does that work? Like, who is in charge of that? In my world, there's a criminal organization that tries to keep some control over that. And the emperor is kind of always like swatting them away, but they also just like letting them do their thing, because it's like too much, it would be too much trouble and too difficult to get rid of them. So I think that's something to consider with economy, is what goods are legal, what goods are not legal, and what like makes things run, and and what's valuable to people. If anyone's played Catan, like there's always like a resource that it becomes like everyone's like, how do I get this resource?
There's none of
like
this.
Nobody's getting it. Yeah, and you're like always like trading like ridiculous amounts to try to get that resource. So I think thinking about what's scarce and what is abundant in your world is important when it comes to economy.
I love
it's always too much sheep. I just saw that in the chat.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, always
too much sheep.
Nobody's ever short on sheep.
I love that game, because you start out, you want wood and brick. Like everybody wants wood and brick. And then there's a point in the game where it's completely switches and everybody wants sheep and ore and wheat. And so it's so funny to me, because it's like, you have, and you've go in with a strategy, obviously, with every game. But back to, and I love trade economy in books. I think that that's really cool. Marina took a completely different route with that in Helm of Midnight. She's trading people's time, like their actual life like span. So that's very interesting. So Marina, tell us a little bit about thinking outside of the box with economy.
So that was specifically a thing that I made do double duty, because it was like, ooh, interesting magic thing that feeds into the magic system, but also like it does double duty for my themes of the book. So the series itself has a lot of themes about bodily autonomy. And basically in the Helm of Midnight, in their world, when you are an infant, you pay a time tax. So somebody comes to you and literally takes time out of your body, puts it in little vials, and then this becomes the money that circulates. And then eventually, at the end of your life, if you are rich enough or so desire to, however much time you've accumulated, you can pull back out and put in your body. So the really rich people are also the very old people. And a lot of other poor people are dying very young. So I guess, yeah, just in general, I don't do a lot of like thinking about economies on like a realistic level, but I do try to do a thinking out of the box. What is a magical resource or a new resource or a strange resource that will fit thematically with what I'm trying to do? So like I said, the time just kind of fit into both the world building magic system and thematically. And then obviously the characters, this also creates some problems plot wise. So my time in a bottle did a lot of heavy lifting actually in the novel.
And in Nomenon, I am trying to think, I'm like, gosh, they didn't really need money.
I mean, they were all on a ship and they were just kind of in Star Trek land where you just have money.
Exactly. I was
socialists.
You're just socials, you're all sharing your resources. And then they did have terrible. So another thing, going back to the whole taboo thing, they had a like cutoff date where you live so long and then you now have to die and become part of the resources and we're going to grow a new person. And so it, because they're in a closed society and you can't have them.
Yeah. And I loved when you came to that part of the book where you just sort of threw that little story in there. And it was kind of like, I had not thought of that to this point, but you would have to absolutely do that because clones are getting born at certain times. They have to be trained in certain, and you have to be, I mean, I was just like, oh my God, like so many things I never thought of. But yeah, on a ship like that, everybody's got a job. So you don't really have an economic system in the way that we would think of. Like there's no trade or barter going on. Right. It's everybody has a job and you do it, or you get thrown on the.
You don't really have a choice to do that. Yeah.
You don't have a choice.
That's the thing. Is world building too isn't about just building like societies that are great. Sometimes you are building societies that kind of do awful things too. And like being able to acknowledge that too, like being aware again of like the bad things about your society versus the good positive things about your society. Taking time away from babies isn't really so great, right?
Yeah. So let's see here. I have, I'm looking at Andrea's outline and I'm just trying to see if I forgot anything on this first page. And I'm looking at the social status and hierarchy, and we touched upon that quite briefly. And I know that there's a lot more there. So let's see here. Like, for example, in Andrea, in your book, there absolutely is a hierarchy, and you show it so well with the orphans. I mean, even from the very beginning, you have a character that's sort of tasked with shuttling children, smuggling them from one island to another. And there's people who get, their like shard ceremony type stuff. And then there seems to be people who don't. And so there is kind of a system there. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing to consider when you are building your characters and your world is where do they stand in the social structure of their world? Where are they on that hierarchy? Are they the people that are in power, or are they the people being oppressed? And how do they feel about that? I know, sometimes even if you are in the class that is being oppressed, you may just feel like this is your lot and this is the way that things are. So is that how your character feels, or are they angry about it? Are they sad about it? And that can reveal things about your character as well as the world and also the culture, because some cultures are more like, hey, this is what we're given and this is how we have to live. And some cultures are a lot more individualistic about that kind of stuff. So yeah, as Tina mentioned, in my world, there is a very strong social hierarchy. It is an empire. There's an emperor who's obviously at the top of the social hierarchy. And he requires a tithing from everybody of a bone shard from behind their ear. And those he uses to power his constructs. And so the way that they have it set up in this world is that everybody types that, and it kind of takes their life force and powers these constructs, and also he writes commands on them. So he's got like several different kinds of constructs. There's constructs of trade, of bureaucracy, of war. There might be another one. This is why I have a wiki. But so it's kind of like one of those things where it's like, well, you're giving something up, but you're getting something in return. And then you have to think like, well, how do your characters feel about that? Do they feel that that is an okay bargain? Do they feel like it's a good bargain? Do they feel like it's an unfair bargain? Because one of the things that you have in a society, and when you have a government, is that you have this bargain between the government and the people in a lot of ways, where it's like the government is providing you with things, and you in turn are providing things to the government. And does that feel like it's a fair exchange, or does it feel like it's an unfair exchange? So I think in the beginning of my book, some people are starting to feel like it's a really unfair exchange. The emperor says that he's doing this to protect everybody from this race of people that have been eliminated from the empire and then are always threatening to come back. But some people don't believe that that's true, or some people don't believe that it's worth the cost. So yeah, there are different, there's a ruling class, and then there's like a regular citizen class. So I think that's one of the things to think about is, where does your character fall in that hierarchy, and how do they feel about it, and are they doing anything to change it? I know in fantasy it's like a huge thing. It's like overthrowing the corrupt the corrupt ruler. That's a very common theme. So whether or not you want to continue that theme, which is fine, it's a great one, or subvert it in some way, I think that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, and I absolutely love how you have two characters. I'm thinking of Falu and Renami, and it's not so much conversations between them, but you actually show it in your world, that how they are from completely different parts of this like caste system that's set up.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things for background, there are two women in an established relationship, and they have very large class differences between them. One of them is the daughter of a governor, and the other one was raised as a gutter orphan, and they're in a relationship. But they see the world very differently, and that causes a lot of conflict for them. So whether or not that's one of the main conflicts for them in the first book is, can they find a way to come together? Can they find a way to bridge that gap? Or does this just mean that their relationship is doomed? And, you know, I've had these kinds of conversations with people that I know where we come from different backgrounds, and we don't see the world the same way. And it can be really frustrating for both sides, because I think, you know, everybody has valid points because your experience is valid. You know, everybody wants to be understood. Everybody wants to feel like somebody else knows where they're coming from. So I think that can be an interesting point of conflict for stories is if you have two people from different backgrounds, like, and they are seeing the world differently, how does that affect the way that they act? And does that mean that they're clashing?
Yeah, that's really awesome. I am looking at the time. I see that we do have about 3 more minutes or so. And but let's see, with our 3 minutes, if if Marina, you had something to say about the hierarchy and social system, definitely let me know. We could switch over to talking about magic and science, wherever people want to go. There is a question in here that talks about how, do you do all this for a short story? So let's kind of like,
Sometimes.
last thoughts with our 3 minutes we've got. Go.
Okay. Yeah. With short stories, it's a much more streamlined thing, right? Like, what do you want to show it? You don't need to do, here's the entire, it needs to be whatever's affecting the immediate story, right? So it's not like I'm going to go into here's the long list of the ways the economy works when I'm not talking about anything that has to do with the economy, right? So that's much more a picking and choosing, slimming down, putting in little hints of things rather than building up a huge, I mean, you might have a huge backstory that you have in your head for a short story, but a lot less of it's going on the page, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I don't have a wiki for my short stories. It's like, 30 pages maybe. So you can kind of just wing it a little bit more.
Whatever's in like the immediate purview of the character.
Right. It's a much more narrow view of the world. So you don't have to have you're not generally writing like a multi-POV story in a short story. I mean, sometimes you are, but it's not going to be like the way that it is in a novel. So you don't have to have like all of those peripheral details like in the mix immediately in that short space. Yeah, I don't know that there's much more to say about that, except that I feel like you can get like a little bit like more experimental with short stories, just because you don't have to have that kind of consistency running for like 400 pages. So you can kind of play around with it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You always want to give the impression that there's more there. Like beyond the short story, there's like this whole other world.
Yeah.
And yeah, for sure. But you don't have to like put that on your, 30-page short story. So we are at the 150 mark. Martin, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to stick around for any questions during the bio break, or how do you?
If we can take the questions to chat and you can hang around. I just want to say it was fantastic material, and it was so good to see you all again, because it has been so long.
I know.
And it's bringing back the memories of this little group going out and tackling conventions as a team. So it was so I'm so happy to see you all today, and so glad you could join us.
You too. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together, Martin. That's amazing.